Welcome to this first of a two-part presentation about St. Mark's Gospel. The aim of the presentations is simply to introduce you to some of the basic ideas behind St. Mark's Gospel, how it came to be written, and some of its content. And the aim, again, is simply to help you gain a better understanding as you begin to study, read, or listen to this Gospel in the lectionary readings at Mass. I'm going to share the screen now with the PowerPoint presentation. And here we go. The Gospel of Mark, Part 1. Here's the front page of St. Mark's Gospel from the Lindisfarne Gospels, with Mark at his writing desk there and the symbol of the winged lion behind him. So here we go. In the year 64 of the Common Era, a huge fire started in the city of Rome. It burned for several days and destroyed a great expanse of the city. This enabled the Emperor Nero to embark on his ambitious plans for a new building program to make the city even more spectacular than it was already. He'd harbored such ambitions for many years, and a rumor began to spread that he had in fact started the fire deliberately himself in order to promote his plans. To try to deflect these rumors, Nero hit upon the idea of putting the blame elsewhere. He turned his attention to a rather shadowy group in the city known as Christians. These Christians had not been any bother to the city before this. It was simply that they were a very secretive group with mysterious practices. The Romans were used to people living among them who worshipped other gods. After all, they had several of them themselves, so what was the problem with another one? The trouble was that this group, unlike pagan groups from other parts of the empire, refused to worship the Roman gods. They refused to worship the emperor himself as a god. And added to this oddity was the secrecy surrounding exactly what they did in their own worship. No outsider was invited to be present at their rituals, and so all kinds of ghastly rumors began to spread about what they were actually up to. Nero instigated a massive persecution of the Christians that lasted for months. During this time, about 2,000 Christians were put to death in the city and surrounding region. They were subject to some horrific means of execution, one of them being a crucifixion. And it's thought that the apostles Peter and Paul were victims of this purge. Ultimately, the sheer magnitude and savagery of the persecution was such that sympathy for the Christians began to grow, and eventually the persecution came to an end. What about those who survived? What were they to do? Not only had they experienced the terror of it all, sometimes it had been members of their own families who denounced relatives to the authorities. No one was sure whom they could trust. Indeed, what was the point of their continuing with the religion at all, if what it led to was to an horrific death? It was in this situation that a man called John Mark put together what amounts to little more than a pamphlet about what Jesus had done. Mark's Gospel only takes about 20 pages up in the Bible. He wrote it as a means of encouragement for a battered and beleaguered people. It's a call to trust, to faith. Although not himself an eyewitness to what Jesus did and said, it's thought that he'd listened to St. Peter preaching about Jesus, was quite possibly a companion of Peter's at one time. The production of what came to be known as a gospel did indeed act as an encouragement to those who'd suffered persecution, and it was something that was copied by others later on, as we'll see. Although the name John Mark is mentioned a number of times in the New Testament, it's not at all clear that these references are either to one person or any of them, in fact, to the author of the Gospel. It was, in fact, quite a common name, like Smith, Jones, or even Hall. Whoever Mark was, he seemed not to be familiar with the geography of Palestine and the surrounding area because he gets locations incorrect on a number of occasions. He writes in fairly crude, sometimes ungrammatical Greek, the common or Koine Greek, that was the language spoken by the ordinary people in the Roman Empire, even in the city of Rome himself. And because he uses some Aramaic words correctly, and some Latin words that he simply translates into Greek, it's thought that he might well have been of Jewish origin and living in Rome. But nothing can actually be proven about this. For centuries, Mark's Gospel was neglected. It was rarely used in the liturgy, and few people made any study of it. Some blame for this lies with St. Augustine, who described St. Mark as a follower, lackey, and digester of Matthew. Why bother with Mark's Gospel when everything that he wrote, as well as a lot more besides, was to be found in St. Matthew's Gospel? This seemed for centuries to be a reasonable way of looking at things, until new techniques of looking at ancient texts began to develop from the 19th century onwards. For centuries, the order in which the Gospels were written was thought to coincide with the order they appear in our New Testament, following Augustine's idea that Mark copied Matthew. It was well known that the first three Gospels could be placed side by side, and the similarities between them compared. They came to be called the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic, looked at together side by side. And as the techniques of literary comparison and analysis developed, a different picture and order of writing began to emerge as a more likely explanation. There on this slide you see part of the parable of the sower. In the left column, what Matthew wrote, in the central column, what Mark wrote, and in the right-hand column, what Luke wrote, and the similarities and differences between them. Now, in an age like ours, when we're bombarded with information coming from all quarters, the preference of many people is for a short summary, a side of A4 giving the gist of the matter. This, however, was not the situation of the early church. Rather than wanting short summaries, it seems much more likely that people were seeking more and more information about Jesus and his life, not less. In that situation, it makes much more sense if we think of St. Matthew, and indeed St. Luke, expanding on what Mark wrote with more material at their disposal. Information about Jesus' earlier life, more about what he taught, and more about what happened after he rose on Easter Sunday. You see, St. Mark's Gospel gives no information about Jesus' early life. He begins with the preaching ministry in Galilee. Although he gives some of Jesus' teaching, he concentrates much more on the things that Jesus did. And in fact, he only mentions that Jesus rose from the dead, but gives no details about any appearances. What also seems strange for someone who supposedly copied Matthew's Gospel was that he makes various incidents that he recounts more difficult for his audience to understand, rather than the more likely scenario of making them easier to understand. For instance, St. Mark has the rather embarrassing incident where James and John go up to Jesus and ask that they get the places of honor in Jesus' kingdom. It causes quite an argument among the disciples. Now, rather than embarrass two of the leading disciples, St. Matthew reports this same incident as their mother asking this question on behalf of her two sons. Similarly, there are examples in Mark's Gospel where Jesus doesn't quite get it right the first time round. This is put right by St. Matthew and St. Luke, but it makes no sense for anyone to make the story more difficult to understand. Now, the vast majority of biblical scholarship in the 19th century was done by Protestants in Germany and by Anglicans in this country. It was only really in the second half of the 20th century that Catholics began to get their game together on this. The net result was that it took Catholics much longer to accept the view that became commonplace in the first half of the last century among other Western churches, namely that St. Mark was the first Gospel to be written, and that both St. Matthew and St. Luke had written copies of that Gospel in front of them when they came to write their own. The order of events and even the vocabulary they use are both much the same as found in St. Mark, with the addition of other material, some of which they both knew, some of which one but not the other knew and included in his Gospel. And although it doesn't solve all the conundrums with regard to how these three Gospels came about, the so-called two-source theory illustrated on this slide offers a working hypothesis. Matthew and Luke had two sources in common: the Gospel of Mark and something usually referred to as Q, the Q source. Quelle is the German word for source, and it's thought that this was covered a lot of the teaching material that's in common between both Matthew and Luke's Gospel. In addition to this, both Matthew and Luke had material of their own to add. Thanks to these developments, and here we see on this slide how much is unique of each of the Gospels, unique to Mark in the purple there, how much of Luke and Matthew depend on that, how much is in both Matthew and Luke's Gospel in the blue, and how much is unique to each of them. Thanks to these developments in scholarship, St. Mark's Gospel came to be seen in fresh light. No longer was it deemed a poor copy of St. Matthew. It now became a vital source of early information about Jesus' ministry. And we'll say more about that in the next part of this presentation.